New York City, September 11, 2018. As an Air India Boeing 777 made its approach to John F. Kennedy International Airport, a cascade of electrical failures disabled numerous vital instruments in the cockpit. In poor weather and running low on fuel, the 4 pilots in the cockpit had to make some crucial decisions. Should they attempt an unfamiliar type of approach into New York, or should they risk taking their electronically crippled aircraft to an airport further afield, where there was better weather, but where they might run critically low on fuel? The fate of all 357 people on board depended on whether the flight crew could successfully manage this complex set of failures for which they had never been trained. This is the story of Air India Flight 101. Air India Flight 101 departed Indira Gandhi International Airport in New Delhi at 2 o'clock in the morning on September 10, 2018. The journey to New York would take 15 hours. On board were 342 passengers and 15 crew. Many of the passengers were families travelling back to New York after visiting relatives in India. There were also a number of students returning to university in the US, as well as some business travellers. The plane was at its maximum capacity and had over 140,000 kilograms of fuel on board. By the time they reached New York, this figure would be just 8,000 kilograms. In the cockpit for the long journey were 4 pilots, 2 captains and 2 first officers. They would each take turns at the controls of the aircraft during this flight, so that each crew member would be well rested for the arrival into New York. The captain of this flight, 49-year-old Rustam Palia, also known as Rusty, was highly experienced, with over 23 years of flying under his belt and 3,500 hours on the 777. It was his first time flying with the 3 other men in the cockpit, First Officer Vikas, Captain Shushant Singh, and First Officer D.S. Bhatti. This crew didn't know it yet, but in a few hours, they would be forced to work together to solve a series of problems that they had never trained for in one of the busiest airspaces in the world. The aircraft being used for this flight was a 9-year-old Boeing 777. Though introduced in 1995, the 777 remains one of the most modern and reliable aircraft in passenger service. This particular aircraft was a stretched version of the original 777, known as the Dash 300 EOR, with EOR standing for Extended Range. Technologically sophisticated aircraft like the 777 require a lot of maintenance, however, and when the pilots of Air India Flight 101 boarded the aircraft in New Delhi in the early morning of September 10th, they were informed that there had been some technical issues with their aircraft on its previous flight. These issues were not deemed critical, however, and apart from the lack of a functioning auxiliary power unit, the aircraft was more or less in a normal state. As a result of this, they were able to depart without delay. The first indication that there were problems with the aircraft occurred 40 minutes after takeoff, when the crew had reached their initial cruising altitude. A warning message appeared on one of the pilot's displays, saying, "Single source radio altimeter." The radio altimeter is an instrument which tells the pilots how high they are above the ground. It's more accurate than the main altimeter, known as the barometric altimeter, because rather than using air pressure to determine the plane's altitude above average sea level, it works by bouncing radio waves off the ground below and measuring exactly how long it takes for the signals to return. For redundancy, the 777 is equipped with 3 radio altimeters, one for captain, one for first officer, and one backup. 2 of these had now failed. This was not a problem while the plane was in cruise, however. The radio altimeter is only used below 2,500 feet, while the plane is on approach. However, if the weather at New York was foggy, and the pilots couldn't see the ground, they would need to be extra vigilant about monitoring their altitude. For the first few hours, this was the only sign that there was trouble brewing in the aircraft's electronic systems. However, when the flight was midway over the Atlantic, the pilots got a warning that their TCAS was not working. TCAS stands for Traffic Collision Avoidance System. It uses radio signals to display the location of nearby aircraft on the pilot's navigation displays. If 2 aircraft are on a collision course, TCAS alerts the pilots of each aircraft and advises them on whether to climb or descend to avoid a collision. The loss of TCAS on board Air India Flight 101 was not critical, however. TCAS is a last line of defence against mid-air collisions. It is the primary responsibility of air traffic control to prevent collisions. However, the pilots were now getting concerned. It wasn't that the TCAS or the radio altimeters were vital systems by themselves, they weren't, but the failure of 2 separate systems raised the question of whether these failures might be related, and if they were related, what other systems might fail before they reach New York? The crew received their answer to this question at just before 8 in the morning, New York time, as they made their final approach to JFK. They noticed as they tried to line up with runway 4 right that their instrument landing system, or ILS, was not functioning. The ILS provides pilots with precise vertical and horizontal guidance down to the runway. It is especially useful on days like this, where the cloud base is very low and pilots are unable to see the runway until seconds before touchdown. On this day, the cloud base at New York was 200 feet, meaning that the pilots were only able to see the runway mere seconds before touchdown. Almost every approach conducted into airports these days is an ILS approach, even in good weather, so a malfunctioning ILS is a significant failure. The aircraft was travelling at over 3 miles a minute at this point, and the pilots needed to act fast to salvage the approach. They used the heading select mode on the autopilot to point themselves towards the runway, while they rapidly set up a different kind of approach in their flight management computer. This is known as an LNAV-VNAV approach, and it uses information from the aircraft's GPS to guide it towards the runway. LNAV stands for lateral navigation, and VNAV for vertical navigation. An LNAV-VNAV approach is not as accurate as an ILS approach, and so is known as a non-precision approach. However, it should get the crew down to the point where they could see the runway so that they could then land visually from there. The crew had never attempted this kind of approach before, and now they would have to try it in poor weather in one of the most congested airspaces in the world. As the pilots continued to set their aircraft up for landing, the gear configuration warning sounded. This alerted the pilots to the fact that the landing gear was not properly extended. After checking the position of the gear lever, however, they determined that the gear was in fact extended, and that this warning must be erroneous. The alarm continued to sound, however, as the pilots drew ever closer to the ground. With such a low cloud ceiling, the crew would have to use the autopilot to land the aircraft. However, with so many important systems going haywire, that was not an option. Rather than continuing with their unstable approach, the pilots decided to abort their landing attempt and climb to 2,000 feet to do some troubleshooting.
Air India 171 going around runway 4 right.
Air India 101 Heavy, roger, fly runway heading, climb and maintain 2000.
Runway heading 2000, Air India 101.
This normal flight had quickly turned into a very high workload situation for the pilots. They were flying low over New York in poor visibility with numerous systems failures they had never experienced before. They had to coordinate with air traffic control to stay clear of other aircraft, all while troubleshooting their issues and deciding what their next course of action should be. Because an LNAV-VNAV approach is less accurate than an ILS approach, pilots are only permitted to land if they can see the runway by a height of at least 600 feet above the ground. For an ILS approach, which is what they would normally do, this would be 200 feet. This limited the pilots' options significantly. The cloud ceiling at JFK was 200 feet, meaning that they could not land there using a non-precision approach. As they conducted their go-around, they communicated this predicament to air traffic control.
The visibility is fine, but the problem we are facing is with the ceiling, because we can't continue with the ILS with a ceiling of 200, because every time we try to lock on to the localizer, the instrumentation doesn't allow us to do that.
Okay, so you cannot do like an auto land or something?
No, auto land is not available, because both we've got two radio altimeter failures. So we're on one radio altimeter, we've got TCAS failures, we've got all multiple instrument failures.
Okay, so let me try and find, so you need something with a better, so what ceiling do you need?
We need something where we have, where we can do like a non-precision approach, and anything above like 600 or so.
Okay, I got it. Okay, I understand now. Just fly heading 220, let me find some weather, pull some weather up, and let me find something.
Okay, thanks.
The controller went to check the weather at a number of alternate airports, and the pilots continued weighing up their options. For all they knew, more systems might well fail over the next few minutes. On top of this, they were fatigued after being in the air for 15 hours, and were eager to get on the ground before they started to run low on fuel. A few minutes later, the controller radioed the pilots with some options.
Air India 101 Heavy, I'm having trouble finding anything that's really that good. I have Albany is 600 feet overcast, and Boston, Logan would be 500 overcast. I'm trying to find Washington Dulles is at 200 feet also.
Okay, and any idea on the trend as far as this goes, or indefinite like you said earlier?
Yeah, the clouds, it's been cloudy with this kind of marine layer for most of the morning, I believe.
Okay. We were just checking Boston as well, because we're getting a little low on the fuel as well, so we need to decide quick.
With just over 7,000 kilograms of fuel on board, the pilots couldn't make it to Albany or Boston. They were simply too far away. They had no choice but to attempt a landing into an airport in New York. But as it stood, the cloud ceiling at JFK, Newark and Stewart Airport was well below the 600 feet they needed for their non-precision approach. To buy themselves time, the crew climbed to 5,000 feet, as they would burn less fuel at that altitude.
Air India 102 Heavy heading 090, climb maintain 5,000.
090, climb and maintain 5,000, Air India 101.
The pilots were now stuck in a difficult predicament. They were circling New York, low on fuel, in poor weather, with numerous systems failures, one of which meant that they could not attempt a landing at any airport in New York. With every passing minute, they were eating into their fuel and further limiting their options. What else would fail in the next few minutes? Air traffic control then cleared the crew to climb to 6,000 feet to further reduce their fuel burn, which would give them more time in the air to weigh up their options. The controller also gave them radar vectors to keep them in the New York area so that they could make an approach quickly if the weather improved. A few minutes later, the controller suggested what he believed would be the best alternate airport available to the crew.
Air India 101 Heavy, I think based on the weather that we have in the area and based on the forecast that I'm seeing, I think Bradley, Kilo Bravo Delta Lima will be your best option.
Okay, and what's the ceiling there?
Okay, right now the ceiling there is 500 overcast, and then the forecast is calling it for it to get better after, between now and 1500 Zulu, it should get a little bit better. They're saying 1,500 feet at 1,500 Zulu, but I'm trying to find Boston also.
Bradley International Airport in Connecticut is located about 200 kilometers northeast of New York City. However, with their fuel situation deteriorating by the minute, the crew were eager to attempt a landing at one of the airports which they were already close to.
Okay, the other thing that we could try over here, because we've got a trend showing the ceiling at JFK is also improving a bit. I could try a VNAV approach, a quick VNAV approach over here.
Okay.
And see, it can take us down in a situation like this, because we're really, stuck and there's no fuel.
At this point, the controller received fresh weather information for Newark Airport, which was much closer to the pilots than Bradley.
And I'm showing Newark just had a special, and they're showing 400 overcast. They just had a special at 1205 Zulu, so about 6 minutes ago.
Okay, so it's a bit better now in Newark, is that correct?
Yes, sir. The weather came up to 400 feet overcast at Newark.
This was still 200 feet lower than the 600 feet the pilots wanted, but with every passing minute, they risked running out of fuel. If they waited any longer, they may not have the freedom to pick their airport. They knew that with a non-precision approach in low visibility, there was a high chance that they would have to perform another go-round. With this as a distinct possibility, they wanted to have as much fuel on board as possible in order to keep their options open. Finally, under increasing time pressure to get the plane down, the crew decided on Newark Airport in New Jersey, which is about 50 kilometers to their south.
Approach India 101. Can we go to Newark? We'll try there.
India 101, so I just have the Newark person here now, so it's the weather's getting a little bit better. They haven't had a go-around due to the weather. Okay, so what we will do is we'll clear to the ILS 4 right at Newark, but you're gonna fly it as a VNAV approach.
That's correct. And if I have a better ceiling, at least once I go visual, I can continue my approach.
The controller started giving the pilots radar vectors to Newark, and then cleared them to descend. The extent of the aircraft's dysfunction becomes clear to the controller when he asks the crew which systems they have lost.
Air India 101, other than both ILSs, both radar altimeters, what other things have failed on the airplane?
basically here we've got single source radio altimeter. We've got TCAS failure, no auto land, windshield system, auto speed brake, and the APU is unserviceable as well.
Okay, I didn't understand that one, the last one. So TCAS failed, no auto brakes, and stand by 1 second.
Moments later, in a sobering reminder to the pilots of the gravity of their situation, the controller asked them,
Okay, Air India 101, so just when you get a chance, give me the people on board and the fuel on board, please.
We have total of 370 and fuel 7,200 kgs, Air India 101.
7,200 kilograms, you said?
Yeah, for Air India 101.
The crew continued setting up their aircraft for a landing as the controller gave them directions to line up with the runway at Newark. They informed the passengers, who at this point were completely oblivious to the extent of the aircraft's problems, that they would be diverting to Newark Airport due to technical issues. At 25 minutes past 8, they contacted Newark Air Traffic Control.
Approach, good morning, Air India 101, 3,000 feet, heading 280, maintain speed 230.
Air India 101 Avenue approach, Roger, Newark altimeter 3012, and verify you have information kilo.
3012, kilo, Air India 101.
Okay, and Air India 101 Heavy, which approach would you like today?
The 4 right, ILS.
Okay, very good, expect ILS 4 right.
As the aircraft made its way towards the airport, the controller sent the airport's emergency vehicles to the runway in preparation for the worst.
Truck 1, while we wait here, nature of emergency is a computer failure. Aircraft type is a Boeing 777 Whiskey model. 270 souls on board and 72,000 kilos of fuel.
Truck 1, got it, thank you.
The pilots used their instruments to line their massive aircraft up at the runway at Newark. They were now locked onto the VNAV path and started their descent down towards the runway. Shortly after this, they contacted Newark Control Tower.
Good morning, Air India 101, ILS 4 right.
101 Heavy, Newark Tower, good morning, 10205, only 4 right, clear to land.
4 right, clear to land, Air India 101.
Landing an aircraft requires focus and full attention at the best of times, but this landing would require the crew to draw on their experience like nothing before. They had been flying for 15 hours at this point, and had been dealing with an unfamiliar set of failures for the past 30 minutes. This untested approach into Newark would be the ultimate test for the pilots, and with their fuel situation getting ever worse, they knew they may not get many attempts at landing. As the pilots flew the aircraft in the rough direction of the runway at a speed of 135 knots, or about 250 kilometers an hour, they could see nothing but whiteness out their windscreen. With every passing second, they became increasingly desperate to see the runway. If they couldn't see it by about 400 feet, they would have to go around. At 1,000 feet above the ground, the crew got too high above their ideal approach path. They used the vertical speed mode of the autopilot to increase the rate of descent from 800 feet per minute to 1,200 feet per minute. Because the pilots had put their aircraft into a steeper descent, however, it started speeding up. If it got too fast, the crew would be unable to land, and would have to waste precious fuel going around for another approach. At this point, the captain disconnected the autopilot and started to fly the aircraft manually. He lowered the flaps further in order to slow the aircraft down. At one point, in the control tower, a warning displayed on the controller's screen that the aircraft was getting too low to the ground.
101, go out to the alert, check out to the moving altimeter 0, pressure 3012.
Having 3012, Air India 101.
At just this moment, the aircraft broke out of the clouds, and the pilots could finally see the runway. However, they were too high and too far to the right of the runway. Captain Palia pushed the aircraft's nose down and steered left to align the plane with the runway. This would be one of only a small number of chances he would get to land this aircraft. Finally, at 8:30 in the morning, the aircraft touched down safely on runway 4 right at Newark. All 357 passengers and crew were safe. Shortly after the pilots had parked at the gate, an intense downpour came over the airport. If the crew had delayed their decision to divert to Newark by just 15 minutes, or if they had attempted a go-around, they would have been unable to see the runway through the rain. By sheer good luck, they made it down just in time. But what had caused all of this in the first place? The 777 is one of the safest aircraft in the sky, with layers of redundancy built into every aspect of its design. How could so many important systems fail? While the findings of Air India's investigation into this incident have not been made public, I have spoken with a number of 777 pilots about the failures which took place on board that day. The common culprit in their explanations is a computer system known as AIMS. AIMS stands for Airplane Information Management System. It's a computer housed underneath the cockpit in the engine and electronics bay of the 777, and it acts as the brain of the aircraft. It uses 4 electrical buses to transfer information between different aircraft computers. A fault with the AIMS itself, or with an electrical bus known as the 629 bus, may have resulted in the cascade of failures which took place on this day. Everything from radio altimeters to the TCAS, auto speed brakes, and wind shear warning system takes information from this system. A failure of the AIMS, or of the 629 bus, explains the set of issues experienced by the pilots on this flight. We can't know this for sure because no official report into this incident has been published. However, it does appear that Air India were aware that this aircraft had significant technical issues before it even departed New Delhi. It seems fair to say that if these issues had been more fully investigated before the flight, proper maintenance could have prevented the entire incident. As safe as the 777 is, it relies on regular maintenance from the airlines flying it to keep it this way. It appears that in this case, that maintenance had not been done. If the visibility at New York on this day had been any worse, or if another critical system had failed, the outcome of this flight may not have been so fortuitous. In the end, this is really one of those times where good crew resource management, careful decision making, and quick thinking on the part of the flight crew saved the day. Special thanks to the Green Dot Patreon and YouTube members for helping to make this video possible. If you'd like to help this channel grow and get some cool perks like early access to new videos, you can do so by tapping on the links here on screen. I'd especially like to thank Andriy Shaishkalov, Anthony Whistler, Antelo Punny, E-Tops, and Garth Farrell for their very generous contributions. I hope you enjoyed this video, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next week for another episode.